exciting. This is our first workshop for 2020, I think, Candice. And we thought, what a better time to kick it off other than in Women's Month, you know. Ideally, these sessions would be great to have in a conference center where we could meet you face to face, but I think given the circumstances, you know, we didn't want to delay this workshop, and nowadays everything's going virtual, so we made a plan.
Thanks, Taylor. So if we can just start off with a basic introduction of what the EDU bootcamp or the EDU program is. I'm sure most of you have you've arrived here either because someone's told you about the bootcamp, you've seen our posts on LinkedIn about the program, or you've applied via the Bamboo platform. So first, welcome everybody. It's great to have you all with us, and happy Women's Month to the ladies out there.
Sorry, Candice, do you mind if I just interrupt quickly? Can I just ask that everyone go on mute if you aren't speaking, just to avoid any background noise? Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. So welcome everyone. This is really an exciting time for all of us to kick off the EDU bootcamp. The EDU program is really a platform and a practical way of bringing women back to work or bringing women to the IT space. So this is an introduction really to what the program is, and over the period of a couple of weeks, you will learn some new skills, you will meet some amazing women and leaders in the IT space. So we really hope that you enjoy the session. Please feel free to ask any questions. What we'll ask is, Taylor, if you don't mind, before we commence with the session today, maybe we can just lay down some ground rules around how we interact in these sessions, and then we'll take some questions along the way.
Yeah, perfect. It's great. I'm just trying to get the presentation open on my side. Candice, do you mind just admitting anyone who joins in now?
Sure.
Cool. Perfect. Okay, cool. Well, I mean, yeah, thanks, Candice, for the nice introduction there. I think just on the virtual meeting guidelines, obviously please just ensure that you're muted at all times unless you're asking a question, just to avoid any background noise. And then obviously we encourage involvement. This session is really, it's really about empowering us. If there is something we don't understand, it's all about bringing the right people together so that we can learn more about it and ultimately enable ourselves in the industry. When you are talking, please can I ask that you speak clearly into your microphone. Obviously we are having a virtual event, so if there is a network delay, there might be some sort of delays in the communication, but we'll just give it a brief period of time to allow for that. Okay. Candice, I know we've sort of done a brief introduction on Eblocks overall, but just to give a little bit more detail, we're essentially a future-focused tech company, and predominantly our services lie within the Agile software development space, data engineering, data science, cloud engineering, strategic assurance, and yeah, I don't know if there's anything else I've missed, but that's really where our service offering lies. And essentially, Eblocks operates off of 3 key pillars which sort of hold us together, and those pillars are profit, purpose, and prosperity. And obviously, profit, pretty self-explanatory. We need to be a profitable organization. We need to be able to pay salaries and cover our overheads and that. And purpose, which is really where EDU sort of fits in, is the types of projects that we like to take on. We like something that has meaning, that gives back. We don't just like taking on projects for the sake of taking them on. We like something that has a little bit more to it. So specifically when we look at our sales plans for the year, we target specific industries where we want to make a difference. And that could be anywhere from healthcare to agriculture. So it's got quite a wide range, but EDU essentially falls part of that purpose pillar because gender equality is something that is quite critical to us, and we've noticed that there is quite a big gender gap within the tech space. So we introduced the EDU program to ultimately bring women back into tech and to start enabling them, whether you've left the tech industry for whatever reason, or maybe you just want to upskill yourself a little bit more. It's really aimed at that, and it's ultimately allowing us to build a network of women in the industry to help us better ourselves and to bridge that gap at the end of the day. And then lastly, we've got the prosperity pillar. Ultimately, we want to prosper ourselves, but we're all about setting our clients up for success as well. So once we work on a project, we want to make sure that when we leave that client, they're set up for success. And the only time they should ever actually need to contact us again is when they've got a new need. And it's really all about that, because we know at least that way we've done our job properly, you know. The next side, I mean, we've spoken about EDU quite briefly as well, and I think before we kick off onto the actual session itself, does anyone have any questions maybe about the EDU initiative or about Eblocks? No one? Okay, cool. Great stuff. Okay, cool. And I'm going to kick things off in the meantime. Candice, I don't know, do you want to do sort of like a roll call or register before we kick off? Or you're on mute. I can see you talking, but...
Taylor, I've managed the roll call, thank you.
Oh, did you? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll probably do a different method of virtual meeting for our next workshop, just so that we can see who's attending, and it just makes it a little bit easier for us to manage things on our side. Okay, great. Cool. So today's session is really an introduction to Agile. And if we have any ladies on the call that are part of our graduate program, some of this information is going to look quite familiar to you. But that's great. I mean, like, Agile is such an interesting topic, so I think the more we memorize it, the better. So yeah, Eblocks essentially uses the Agile methodology to support all of its delivery, whether it's internal or external. So it's really the foundations that we lay with any new joiner that joins the company. And I think Agile in itself has become such a buzzword in the IT industry, but not many people understand what Agile actually is. Or we hear organizations say, you know, Agile doesn't necessarily work, but then when you dig deeper into the trenches, you'll see that they're not actually applying Agile in the right ways, which is why it's not working. And we've heard so many success stories, but it's really about laying the foundations and truly understanding what it means to be Agile in order to take that into your organization and to use it to support your delivery projects. So before we get started, I've just got some questions here. For all the ladies in the audience, has anyone maybe worked in an Agile environment before, or do you want to just give us your understanding of what you think Agile means? It doesn't even need to be in the tech context. What does Agile, or the word Agile, mean to you in general?
Sorry, what's the best way etiquette for us to... I see there's no raise hand functionality. So if we do want to talk, is there a way that we can maybe indicate that we want to talk?
Look, I mean, how we've managed this in our previous knowledge sessions, generally the first person to turn on their mic and start speaking will manage it that way.
Okay.
But I can sort of see who's talking when, so I'll keep an eye on it.
Okay.
Cool. But yeah, if you want to give input, just turn your mic on and then we'll manage it that way.
Perfect. Do you mind if I give it a shot?
Yeah, sure, please.
Perfect. Because I've worked in Agile for about 4 years now in different organizations, and you're right, every organization does have their own sort of flavor and how they've interpreted it. But for me, Agile is more about a culture, and then processes tend to follow. So it's meant to more be around the culture of transparency, the culture of, exploring, going ahead, adding value in small increments, learning from them, and then getting that velocity to move forward. But I've always found one of the biggest places that people miss Agile is they tend to go for process over culture. And it's very strong on the culture because it actually has to be a trust culture. One where everybody has that level of trust to even be transparent and raise issues and raise their opinions and their thoughts, to be surfaced, to kind of move forward.
And I mean, I completely agree with you. It's Louise, yes?
Yes, sorry.
So I'm just making sure. I just want to check the names on the board. So I'm alternating between two screens. But yeah, I mean, you're completely right. And you know what? Agile. Every organization may face challenges when they take on this Agile approach, but I think the types of challenges you run into is going to vary per organization, because sometimes when you take on this Agile approach and you want to start adopting that Agile way of working, it's not just a team change, it's sometimes an organizational change that needs to happen in order to adopt that culture. And I think when we go through the slides further on, like Louise has mentioned, it is a culture change. A lot of the principles that sort of lay the foundation for Agile, a lot of it, when you look at it, it's going to look like common sense. But if you look at it carefully, that's actually probably where majority of the challenges lie within your organization. And fixing those things or trying to align those principles is really what's going to enable Agile throughout your organization. Does anyone else maybe have any input? No one. Okay, cool. Let me proceed. Cool. So basically, we've said how Agile is this major buzzword, but really what we want to try and establish in the session today is what Agile is and why it is so effective and why it's worthwhile adjusting to this way of working. Okay. So essentially, Agile in itself means the ability to create and respond to change. And ultimately, when we look at the Agile way of working, it's all about dealing with and ultimately succeeding in an environment that is turbulent or maybe a little bit uncertain. Okay. Now, the authors of the Agile Manifesto originally designed this to be something that was intended for software development. And although it's intended for software development, I have seen how you can apply Agile in almost every type of industry or sector within your business. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Really what we want to know about Agile is, I mean, the authors essentially named this manifesto Agile because the word Agile expresses this idea of adaptiveness and responding to change, which is so important in their approach. Now, with Agile, you're going to hear a lot of words like Scrum, extreme programming, Kanban, stand-up, sprints. All of these frameworks and all of these practices essentially form part of the Agile umbrella. So they all sit under this umbrella term, which are based on the values and principles which are expressed in the Agile Manifesto. Okay. Now, it's really good to essentially live by these valuables and these principles in order to help you figure out the right things given a particular context on a project. Okay, so here we can see we've got a couple of the frameworks there and the practices that you can use. Now, it's important here when we look at this because, and we'll discuss in a bit more detail just now, but if you are following a Scrum approach or a Kanban approach, that doesn't necessarily mean you're Agile. It means that you have a Scrum framework in place or a Kanban framework in place. But Agile in itself is essentially the overarching element that supports those practices. Okay. Then next up, I'm going to look at the Agile Manifesto. Okay. So essentially, the Agile Manifesto states that we are essentially uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Now, part of this manifesto, we've sort of uncovered four values which help support that Agile mindset and drive value when delivering on a project. Okay. The first one we have is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Now, this one is quite a good one because valuing people better over the process and tools is quite easy to understand because it's ultimately the people who respond to your business needs and drive the development process. If the processes and tools drive that development, the team is likely to be less responsive to the change and less likely to meet those customer needs. And this speaks a lot to that culture that Louise was talking about, is you can't just let processes control everything. It's the people who actually drive it out, and it's that team culture that essentially is more important because that's essentially where your value is going to lie. A nice, easy example of this is communication. So in the case of communication, when it's between individuals, communication is fluid and it happens when a need arises. If you let communication be controlled by a process, then it's very scheduled. It requires specific content, and it could almost mean delays in your processes as well. Okay. Next, we have working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, if you've worked on a project before, you'll probably know that, and I mean, especially if it's a waterfall project, you'll know that you've probably spent countless days and hours documenting different requirements for the product development, and like this is all got to be sorted before you can even begin your delivery process. And you're looking at everything from technical specifications, your design documents, test plans, and all of these documents are going to need approval. Now, this is quite an extensive list of documentation, and it can cause quite lengthy delays in your development. Now, Agile doesn't necessarily eliminate documentation, but Agile allows us to streamline the documentation in such a way that we're able to give a developer everything that they need in order to get the work done without being blocked by delays in documentation or approval and all the discussions that happen in the background. Now, one of the Agile documents I'm referring to specifically here is a user story. Now, for those who maybe don't know what a user story is, it's essentially a business requirement or user requirement for a product, and it contains everything that product would need to do. And I use quite a simple scenario of coffee. So if I were to say, for example, as an employee, I'd like to drink coffee so that I can function. On that specific card, we're going to have everything that's needed for that cup of coffee to work for me. So maybe I want my coffee black, but occasionally I want some milk in it. I also like it with 2 sweeteners. So all of that information there to allow us to determine what done looks like for that piece of work is going to be included on there, along with the priority, how much work effort's required to complete that, if there's any dependencies. And that's enough for the developer to start beginning that piece of work. And he doesn't have to wait weeks and weeks for us to prepare all of the requirements. We have one, and we can start the development and show value quite quickly. So, I mean, we value documentation in Agile. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we're not going to have any documentation. But ultimately, we value working software a lot more than the documentation. And I think this is quite easy to understand because if you were at a client and you gave them your requirement spec, for example, the first thing they're going to ask you after that is, okay, well, when can I see it? When can I see something tangible? They're always going to want to see something of value. And that's where that working software element comes in. So if we're able to speed up that documentation phase so that we can start delivery, it's a win-win scenario for both of us. The third one we have is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Now, negotiation is obviously the period where the customer and your product manager would work out the details of the delivery, and there may be points along the way where those details will need to be renegotiated, whether it's a cost implication or it's the actual features themselves that we're developing against. Now, collaboration is quite different. With development models such as waterfall, you tend to negotiate the requirements of the product in quite a lot of detail before you actually start any of that work. While when we look at the agile side of things, we essentially get a customer who is engaged and is able to collaborate throughout that development process, making it far easier for us to meet their needs and making it far easier for us to see if there's any changes. If you've got that customer collaboration throughout that process, if something doesn't necessarily meet their expectations, we're able to pick up on it a lot quicker. We'll fail fast, and we pick up the pieces that we carry on. Whereas if you don't have that collaboration, if something needs to change, then it's a whole long discussion. We have to map out how it changes, and it can cause quite significant delays in our development process. I know it's not always ideal, because I know sometimes you'll have your customer can't always be in all the discussions, and they can't always sit alongside your developers. But we may find that it's useful to have that customer included at specific points within your, let's say we're on a Scrum project, there's specific points or ceremonies that we would have as part of our sprints, and we would include the customer in those sessions to get their feedback, and it's quick feedback. It's a quick demo, we show them what we've done, or they're part of our daily stand-ups. They can see where the challenges are, they can see what progress is being made. And as a customer, you want to stay informed, you want to know what's going on. And it allows you to be a little bit closer to the nitty-gritty details of the project. Again, that's good for the customer and stakeholder management, but from a development perspective, it's also good for us because we know exactly what we need to be building and we know that we're on the right track. Then lastly, we have responding to change over following a plan. Now, traditionally in projects or project management, whether it's software development or any other project, change was always regarded as an expense, because obviously when things change, it's more time, and ultimately there might be new technology, and it's a large investment for the company, so it tends to be avoided. But the intention here is that with Agile, we see change as adding more value. So we know, I can't tell you one project that I've worked on where nothing has changed. There's always going to be something in the details where new requirements pop up, or the timelines change, or whatever happens. You could pick up on a bug that needs to be resolved, and that could take us maybe a week or so. We don't know. But the intention is to develop detailed and elaborate plans with a defined set of features with everything, and that's great because you've got a view of everything. But at the same time, you need to be able to adapt and bring in new pieces. And I know there's different approaches to doing this. If you look at the Scrum approach, with Scrum you generally commit to all your tasks up front, and generally you wouldn't necessarily change the scope of what you've committed to for a sprint. But if we look at something like extreme programming, their change is slightly easier to welcome in, because although, and with extreme programming, essentially what happens is if something is if you've committed to something and there's something slightly more important and you haven't started working on the one task, and the work effort is roughly the same, it's easy to swap those two out. Whereas with Scrum, if new requirements come in, we evaluate those requirements. We don't necessarily pull them into the sprint because that impacts what we're trying to achieve for that 2-week period, or however long it's going to be. But we'll look at it, bring it into the backlog, reprioritize, see where things fit in, and we adjust that plan accordingly. So it's really all about that adaptiveness. Now, all of these different values, and we've obviously got 4 of them, each of the different frameworks that fall under Agile rely on them to guide the development and the delivery. And they're going to apply them in different ways. And none of them are the same, which is, it's expected. but these are ultimately the concrete foundation that lay the basis for those frameworks to work. It's one thing to have a framework that tells you how to do something, but without this type of mindset or way of working, you're not going to see it implemented as successfully. Okay. So just a quick one, just to see if everyone's following. I mean, you can turn your mic on and you can let us know your answer, but this is just a quick little multiple choice question here where we say, you know, the Agile Manifesto tells us that we should value responding to change over following a set plan. So the first one we have here, we have changes are accepted until the point that the first sprint begins, then changes are deferred to a future release. The second one we have is changes are accepted only if other features are removed from the backlog such that a fixed end date is maintained. Thirdly, changes are accepted up until about halfway through the project, then all changes are deferred to a future release. And lastly, changes are accepted at any time during the development effort, depending on the business value of the change and the product owner's acceptance and the ability for the dev team to respond in a time frame that is acceptable to that product owner. So which one do you guys think is best suited in terms of the Agile Manifesto? Everyone's writing in the chat, that's great. Pardon me?
I think 4 is the correct answer.
You are correct. So everyone in the chat, just see everyone's got it right. And that's right. I mean, if we think about it, that's what Agile is. Agile is all about welcoming change. Like I said, they'll do it in different ways. Like I just explained, Scrum obviously welcomes change in a different way, Extreme Programming in another. But at the end of the day, if that change has business value, we'd be silly to turn it away. It's just about reprioritizing where things come in and seeing how that impacts us. Obviously, you've got to maintain that stakeholder management because given that there is a change, something else is likely going to be impacted. But that's why it's also so important that you've got a product owner on your project that's able to prioritize and justify that business value and see where it fits in along the way. Without that, you're going to have no plan and we're just going to be building things willy-nilly, you know? That's great. Next, we're going to move on to the 12 Agile principles. And these are quite nice. And it talks back to what Louise mentioned earlier in terms of that culture in which we welcome change. And like I said earlier as well, you know, we're going to work through these. And a lot of this is going to appear like common logic to you. And I think that's the tricky thing at the end of the day is these are actually very simple things that are so obvious to us when we think about it and when we discuss it now. But when it comes to actually implementing it on a project, that's where the challenge really lies. And because it's not just, it's a team culture shift, it's an organizational shift, especially if you haven't been exposed to this type of working or way of working before. Okay. So the first one that we have is our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So we spoke about this briefly already. I mean, customers are always happier when they are receiving working software at regular intervals rather than waiting extended periods of time between the releases. With this as well, you're able to manage the risk better on your project. So background noise. Thanks. So think about it. If you are building a massive piece of software and releasing it in big chunks, when you do those releases, the risk is far greater because it's hard to control such a big scope of work. Whereas if you're releasing working software at regular intervals, the risk is a lot smaller to manage. And if something breaks, it's easier to identify where that break is, and the setback will be far less. At the same time, your customer also wants to see working software. I mean, I don't know if anyone's really worked on these types of projects before, but your customer's always going to ask you, when am I going to see something? When can I see something tangible? When is a working product going to land? Because at the end of the day, it's costing them money. And they also, they have a vested interest in whatever you're building, and they want to see results. So if we're able to show those results at regular intervals, It's going to enable a trusting relationship because they know, you're delivering exactly what we need. If there are changes, we address them immediately. And the customer can also see that whatever it is that we're building, it's meeting their expectations. Because a lot of the time, sometimes your customer may think they know what they want, and then you build it, and then it turns out, oh no, that's actually not what I wanted. Can we change it? And by then, it's like 3-4 months down the line, you've spent a lot of time developing something, and now you've got to go rework it. And obviously, that's a delay on our side, and it's a delay on their side. We don't want that. Secondly, we have welcoming changing requirements even late into development. So this is something we just spoke about. Now, I mean, the Agile process is essentially harness change for the customer's competitive advantage there. So, I mean, any change that comes in must be valid. I mean, and we're quite strict on our side as well, because you've also got to protect your development team from changes that could impact them as well. So any change that needs to come into your backlog when you're on a project needs to have some sort of business value attached to it. And we need to be able to see how that is going to impact us. So we're not saying we're going to discard it. We will accommodate it. But we need to be able to plan around that so that we're still able to avoid delays when a requirement or a feature changes. Because there will likely be impact, but we've got to be able to manage that and adapt to it. Okay. Then we have deliver working software frequently. Okay, so we've just spoken about this one. We know that Scrum accommodates this principle as well. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Scrum, the Scrum framework essentially operates in something called a sprint. And a sprint can be anywhere between 2 weeks and 4 weeks long in terms of development time. And ultimately, at the end of that 2-week or 4-week period, we want to be able to showcase and deliver a working piece of software. It doesn't have to be the complete thing, but it needs to be small working components of the bigger picture that we're trying to build. Okay, and I mean that speaks very much to point 1 as well. Then we have business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. So this one's really important, and I mean it sounds a bit repetitive because I have addressed it already, but collaboration between your business stakeholders and your developers throughout a project is critical. Because if there is any misalignment between what your business stakeholders are expecting and what your developers are building, we're going to have big trouble down the line. So we need to make sure that we are building the right thing. And also at the same time, managing their expectations. If your business stakeholders are continuously involved, where necessary, obviously, because we know some stakeholders will have a vested interest to be participating daily. Some need to be informed maybe on a weekly or bi-monthly basis. But essentially, better decisions are made when the technical and business teams are aligned. So we can show them exactly where certain points in the software maybe aren't working, where we have so I'm just looking at the chat there quickly, where we have certain challenges that can be addressed, where there are feature changes, those can already be accommodated. If the technical team has a different approach, we're able to communicate openly with the business to say, you know what, this is a slightly better approach. What is your feel? And that transparency and that openness becomes fluid between both teams. And essentially, I mean, they're 2 separate groups of people, but we're all working towards the same objective. Okay, then we have building projects around motivated individuals. So no one wants to go into an environment where you're unhappy, you are not motivated, there's no trust, you're not supported, you're not actually going to be working very productively. And I must be honest, this is something that Eblocks values quite extensively. We've built quite a nice environment for our developers where we know that if we need support, whether it's in your personal life or in your working environment, the support is there for you. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this environment that you work in needs to be so carefully constructed to make sure that your teams are motivated to deliver the best work. Because think about it, if you're an unhappy team, you're not going to be motivated, you're not really going to put a lot of effort into your work. The quality of your work might be jeopardized. So this is such an important element. And I know that, I mean, you don't have to answer the question, because I know it's quite a personal one, but there are people out there who work in these types of environments, and it can be very challenging. Okay. Then number 6, okay, I challenge this one slightly. The most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within the development team is face-to-face conversation. So, up until pre-lockdown, I would have agreed with this. But given the day and age that we live in, and the way I speak from an Eblocks perspective because we've had to adjust as well. We're no longer working in the same room as our teams. We're all working remotely now, and we've had to adjust to this. And while face-to-face interactions are very effective, we have found methods to make virtual interactions just as interactive, just as effective. And although your communication is obviously a little bit more fluid when you're co-located, we've also come to the point where we've said, if something needs to be addressed, you pick up the phone and you phone someone, or you go onto Slack and you message someone, because we're all online during the day. So yes, while face-to-face interaction is definitely valuable, I think that in the day and age that we're living in, you please feel free to disagree with me on this one, but we have all the tools and technology that allow us to work remotely and even work on an international scale. We don't have to be in the same room as someone, and it's just as effective. Does anyone have any questions on these 6 principles before I move on?
Hi Taylor, can I ask a question?
Sure.
With regards to point 5 that you've got there with motivated individuals, I found with experience it's challenging to motivate people because it has to come from themselves, and if someone loses motivation, in order to get that back, how do you go approaching that? What is the best way that you found is effective?
So look, I think it's very dependent on the situation as well. If it's something that's demotivating you within your work environment, that can be quite easily addressed. And I think in order to do that, you've got to have quite an open and transparent environment. So I know, like, if I was having a challenge within my team, or whether it's my own way of working, at Eblocks, we've got quite a successful setup, or quite a flat organizational structure. So I can go to anyone in my team and they will help me address it. Whether it's a complaint, whether I don't have like the right software, or when it's frustrating me, those things are all readily addressed. And I think they're taken quite seriously, because ultimately you want to be set up for success. You don't want to be working in an environment where you aren't set up to succeed, because that's not constructive to yourself nor the organization. At a personal level, that's where it can be a little bit challenging, because not everyone is open to speaking about challenges that they've had in their personal capacity. And it can, we all know if you had a bad day or something's happening at home, it can impact your work. What I've found is, either if you've got a close work colleague or a close friend, or even if you maybe want to reach out to like a life coach or someone like that, get the necessary support that you have available to you, because you can't, as much as we want to, you can't handle everything on your own. Sometimes you also need a little bit of an outsider's perspective and an unbiased perspective as well to help you accomplish certain things. And like, if it's something personal that you're dealing with, these things aren't fixed overnight. It's going to take changes in maybe your daily routine, and like small changes that you're going to have to do within your life. But ultimately, I think it's very important that if you are experiencing something within your personal capacities, to let your company know as well. So making sure that you've got the right support within your organization, so that if something is happening within your personal capacity, they are aware. And if something does happen at work, and your work is potentially impacted, then your team are aware that, let's see how we can support you a little bit better and help you overcome these hurdles.
Thank you. So as a team, for like a fellow colleague or somebody, you'd reach out and sort of say that we're all there for you, and it's a possibility that you can talk to us at any time and be transparent to let them know that that's available.
Exactly. It is, and I mean, it is quite difficult, and but I think it's also that, I mean, you should never be afraid to go and tell a colleague or your boss that you have something going on, because then it's not a constructive environment to work in. I think, and I mean, Candice can agree with me here. I mean, whenever I have something going on, Candice is the first person I go to, because we've got a very strong working relationship together. And I mean, we've developed that over time as well. And I just think, in terms of that, I mean, transparency is incredibly important on a project, whether you're dealing with something personally or it's on the project that's frustrating you. Let people know. It doesn't have to be someone within your team. Just reach out to people, because dealing with something on your own can be very challenging as well, and it can get you into almost a worse situation sometimes. It is going to vary per individual.
Thank you.
Cool.
Hello. Hi there.
Hi there.
Yes, hello. Well, I haven't had any experience with Agile. I haven't started working yet. I just graduated, but I just wanted to ask, from a student's perspective, because I don't really know how it works in the working environment, how effective is Agile really? Because how effective is it as far as deadlines are concerned? Because if it allows for so much change, does that not put pressure on developers and then force them to not meet deadlines? Like, how effective is it really?
So you've got a very good point. So I mean, I've worked in a waterfall environment as well as an agile environment. Now, waterfall, obviously, there's strict deadline in place, and we build everything and then we release to meet that deadline. Okay. And with agile, obviously, we develop incrementally and over a period of time, but not to say that we do not have a deadline. Okay. So I'll give you an example for a current project that I'm doing. So we have a deadline for a client to build a piece of software, and it's quite a large piece of software by the end of by the end of September, so 1st of October really. So that is our deadline. So what we need to do, and this is really where my role comes in as the BA and the Scrum Master, is I control essentially the flow of the work. So you've got to make sure that you're planning your work incrementally out to make sure that we're going to cover everything. And it's all about, I mean, you'll see in Agile, we talk of terms like velocity as well. Essentially, once you've started your first iteration, after like one or two iterations, you can sort of gauge how fast your team is able to work based on the amount of work effort that is required, because we measure those things in Agile. Based on that, I can then determine how much work we can do per sprint and if we will actually meet that deadline. And if new requirements come in, because we know they do, it's all about looking at it going, okay, how big is that scope of work? So we'll pull our entire development team together and they'll look at it and scope it out. We'll look at all the requirements, we'll look at all the performance criteria, the acceptance criteria that determine whether that software is done. And they'll tell me, okay, you know what, that's maybe, it's quite a lot of work to be completed. We do planning poker on our side, so we'll size it in terms of effort, so maybe they size it as an 8. Based on that size of the work, we can take that into our planning and see how that's going to impact that deadline. In which case, we're able to go back to the business and have a conversation about it and say, you know what, this feature that's just been introduced, this is where the impact is. If they choose to maybe deprioritize some of the other features and accommodate it that way, that's one way of doing it. Or alternatively, you shift that deadline out slightly. Okay. And I mean, it's not to say that on a waterfall project, things might not change either. You could have that same deadline and more changes just coming in, and you've still got to deliver. It's also the same principle applies. You go, you know what, this is a new scope of work, and we've got the same deadline. Either we need to add maybe more developers to the project, which doesn't always solve your problem, because sometimes when you're adding fresh new eyes to a set of work, you've obviously got to upskill those team members, you've got to get them set up technically, and that also causes delays in your process. So it is it's quite an interesting discussion to have, but it's all about managing your customers' expectations. So we welcome the change, but seeing how that change impacts the development and how we manage that change within our process, that's where it becomes really important. Because any change that comes in will likely have business value. If there's no business value attached to it, we can argue that change. Yeah. And ultimately, though, if you're working on an agile project, the odds of your product owner bringing in a piece of work that adds no business value is very slim. Generally, it's something that's always important and is actually going to enable your solution at the end of the day. Cool. But yeah, great question. Are there any other questions from the floor?
Brad, I met you. That's my spot right next to the recycling bin. Some guy took over here last year, so I want to
Cool. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Sorry, I'm alternating between all these different screens so I can see who's talking and then trying to get back to my presentation. There we go. Okay. So next up, in terms of the principles, we have working software is the primary measure of progress. So in other words, delivering functional software to the customer is the ultimate factor that determines whether we're doing what we need to do. If we are not delivering anything to our customer, something is going wrong and we need to assess what's happening. Either we're not managing the change correctly, maybe your team has oversized the work that they've committed to and it's actually not achievable within a 2-week period, and that needs to maybe be broken down into smaller components so that we can see the movement and the progress being made. So these are all things that we need to keep track of when we're looking at our software development. And I mean, it doesn't even need to be working software. Like I said, we've seen Agile being applied in the finance industry and recruitment, so it doesn't necessarily always refer to software. But as long as you've got something tangible to look at the end of your 2-week period, or however long your sprint may be, that shows that you are actually doing what you need to do. And obviously you'll set goals for your iteration or your sprint, whether it's a certain functionality that you're out to achieve, or it's a certain technical setup that you're out to achieve, or maybe it's even resolving a couple of bugs that you picked up. You never know what your team's going to commit to. But ultimately, achieving that at the end of the day and showcasing that into something tangible that's working is really where the value lies for your customer. Then we have Agile processes support sustainable development. So the team should be able to maintain a constant pace of delivery. Now, this talks back to that velocity that I just referred to. So once your team has sort of found its feet, and if you're working in a constant environment, then your team's velocity, and you work with the same people, the velocity will be constant as well. However, if new people coming together and maybe it's a new piece of work in an industry maybe you're not familiar with, or the technology stack that you're using is slightly different, that could also impact your velocity initially. But ultimately, you want to get to a point where your team is able to establish a repeatable and maintainable speed at which they can deliver software. And this is really important because, like I said, that's what we use for our planning. So in other words, if, let's say, for example, like I said, we use planning poker in terms of our sizing, so we size in terms of effort. If I know my team can only achieve 10 user story points, or 10 user story points in terms of effort for a given sprint, in the next sprint, I can't plan for 20 user story points because I know that they're going to be set up for failure. So maybe you could push to like 11, maybe 12, depending how things go. But you don't want to overcommit within a sprint, especially if you know what your team's capacity and what their speed is in terms of delivery. That's really important because that obviously ties back to your deadline dates as well. Okay, and this takes some. It might vary depending on your team. So if you start off with 5 developers, maybe your velocity will be X. If you add additional developers to that, your velocity might increase very slightly. No, it won't double or triple, but it will increase over time, and it will increase by small amounts. So we've got to keep an eye on these types of things because they do impact the pace of delivery on a project. Okay. Then continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. So if you've got the right skills and the right design, then you know that your team are going to be able to constantly maintain their pace and improve the product over time, as well as sustain change. Okay, so this is quite a an interesting one because obviously your team's also got to be set up in the right way in order to get this right. You'll see we'll talk to it now when we get to point 11, where we talk about self-organizing teams. The team's able to self-organize themselves to make sure that they can deliver what they need to deliver without having to necessarily rely on anyone else or anything to get the job done. So when new things come in, it almost becomes like second nature. We know that, you know what, we've got the skills we need. This is how the change is going to impact us. This is how much effort's going to be required. Okay, let's put it in, let's go. That's the type of mentality we need to have. It's really just about if it comes in, we see how it impacts us, we see where it fits in, and we develop against it. Because at the end of the day, whatever we develop is going to give value to our customer. Then number 10 says here, simplicity is essential. So when we look at projects, especially on like our Agile projects, because we're generally working in sprints, it's not about building the whole thing in one sprint because that's nearly impossible. Depending on obviously what it is that your customer wants, maybe it is 2 weeks worth of work. But essentially, it's all about developing just enough to get the job done right now. So you might have heard of things like your MVP, so your minimal viable product. So a lot of the time, when we start on a project, we take a look at what that MVP is, and we develop against that. So when we're developing, we take a thin vertical slice of that product, and we just develop that end to end, because that gives you an idea of your product from start right through to the end, and you can always improve on it over time. And generally, when you look at that thin slice approach, you're able to break that down into smaller components that we can deliver quite quickly. But we're not necessarily building the entire thing. I know if you think of like the bicycle, for example, you always start, if your customer wants a Ferrari, okay, you're always going to build the bicycle first. You're not just going to go straight to the Ferrari. You've got to start with the foundational steps. You'll first start with a little bit of this, a little bit of that, before you get to that Ferrari view. Okay. Then number 11 here, best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. So what this means is skilled and motivated team members who have decision-making power are able to readily take ownership and communicate with one another in order to share ideas that will deliver quality products. So if you don't have a say in anything, if you maybe don't necessarily have the right skills, or you're demotivated, like I said, the quality of your product is going to be impacted. Whereas if you are free to organize yourself, so in other words, you decide what work you're taking on when, provided obviously it fits in with the scope of your sprint that you've committed to, you have the decision-making power to deliver quality when you need to. And because you have this, there's no sort of like micromanagement or anything like that. The teams sort of lead themselves. I know for a fact that, I mean, if I go and leave for a day, I don't have to worry about my team not being able to function without me, because they'll be able to pick up the pieces. They know where everything is. If they need something, they go to the right person, they get it done, and they build. Nothing really stops them from doing that. They don't necessarily need someone to say, okay, well, come work on this next and then work on that, because you're essentially just being told what to do the whole time. Whereas here, you're given the freedom to sort of pick up exactly what you want to, when you want it, provided it's in that prioritized list. So I must emphasize here, though, maybe that in Scrum, you'll see that a little bit in terms of if we commit to 10 user stories, depending on the priority, the team may select whichever high priority task they want to start with first, and maybe they'll pick up the second one next. Whereas in for extreme programming, for example, the priority sort of drives what task you pick up next, but it still allows the team to self-organize against those prioritized tasks. Okay. Then lastly, we have at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. So, and I think you'll see this a lot in like your personal life as well. A lot of the time we have to sit back and reflect on ourselves to see how we can make improvements and become more effective. And whether it's self-improvement, process improvement, advancing a person's skills or their techniques, this is all something we need to reflect on because it's going to help us deliver more effectively. So at Eblocks, what we do at the end of every iteration, we have something called our retrospective, where the team comes together and we literally sit down very openly and we discuss what went well, what didn't go well, and for the things that didn't go well, what are we going to do to fix them? And we'll vote on it and we see exactly what needs to be done. And the following iteration, we'll see, okay, did we actually address all of the concerns or the same things popping up? Because otherwise we're not actually making any progress. So, I mean, that's really an important one. And it's not necessarily a session where you can point fingers and blame, because at the end of the day, if something went wrong on your project, the team's accountable for it, not a single person. Because the team commits to the goals, not one individual. But this type of approach really allows us to reflect on everything that's happening within our sprints in order for us to be better and develop good quality working software at the end of the day, because that's the last thing you want. You want to make sure that whatever you're building is of quality. And if there are process improvements or skill shortages that are impacting that, then we need to address that as soon as possible. Okay. Do we have any questions on the remaining principles here?
Hi, Taylor. Sorry, I have another question.
Sure, Chelsea, what's up?
With regards to skill set, so let's say the project came about and you all jump on, you all start developing. Then later down the line, someone finds out that they don't have the necessary skills to keep up with the team, and that is discussed in the retrospective corrective sessions we have there. And how do you adjust or how do you adapt to that with that individual in the team? How do you catch them up? Because that will take a while, I'm assuming, for that person to learn that software or that framework.
Yeah, so look, it can take a while. I mean, we've had an instance this year where one of our developers was also introduced to a completely new technology, and he managed to learn it in like the space of a week. But I think it's also, I mean, that's impressive, but it's also important to recognize that Eblocks has a culture where we encourage continuous learning. So we have, I mean, for any new joiner that joins our team, we've got access to different learning sites where you're able to take courses freely whenever you want to. We also do weekly knowledge sharing sessions between our team members. So, and everyone attends the team. So, I mean, me for myself, I'm not a particularly technical person, but I'll attend all the technical sessions because it helps me to understand what my team's doing in a bit of a better light. And it doesn't even go into like a lot of detail sometimes. Sometimes it's just like a brief introduction to what this type of technology is. But it also just gives you a bit of insight. We do that once a week. But if someone comes across an interesting article, we share it. And the nice thing is, I mean, if there's a technology that we're interested in learning, we discuss it openly with our teams and with the relevant colleagues in that, to make sure that if there is something new, we essentially just say, okay, you know what, this is the latest technology that's entering the market, let's upskill ourselves. And we either go on training. I mean, a lot of our team members are currently going through their AWS Cloud Practitioner training, and it's what was I going to say? So I've lost my train of thought. it's really just about making sure you make the right people aware of what you want to learn so that they can enable that. Because at the end of the day, your employees are your greatest asset at the end of the day, because you have all the knowledge, and if upskilling you means that we get to add to that value, then great. We also look at an approach called paired programming. So that's essentially where two developers will work together on a set of work. And what that allows us to do is, if one developer is more experienced in that technology than the other, the one can learn from the other one, but also it gives you two eyes on that set of work. So it speeds up our QA process, because now you don't necessarily need to go through quite an in-depth QA, because you've already got someone else checking out your work the whole time, and you're testing and challenging each other constantly. I don't know if Kat or Jerry are still on the line. If you maybe want to just give a little bit more insight into the knowledge sharing. I know Jerry's just hosted an awesome knowledge sharing session for almost about a month now on an introduction to data science for our graduate program. And I mean, that's obviously outside of Eblocks, but that just shows our environment and the type of environment we like to enable for everyone. But it is really important. I mean, there's so many different free resources out there as well. Like, if you go onto YouTube, there's so much information out there. I mean, the internet is, sky's the limit, right? There's Udemy courses you can take. There's white papers online. So if there is something that you're interested in learning, Google it. Otherwise, if there is someone specific who's able to help you and maybe mentor you on that, then that's also something you could look at doing.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Cool. Okay, are there any other questions?
We have a few questions going in the chat.
Sorry, let me
We've been talking amongst ourselves. I don't know if you want to have a quick.
Let me have a look here. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to work through the whole conversation here.
Is Agile just for software development? And there was a question about, is it the same as DevOps?
No. So DevOps and Agile are essentially two different things. But let me answer the first one first. So although Agile was mainly intended for software development, and the next few slides will probably explain this in a bit more detail, so I'm actually just going to go to them. But I mean, we've got a question here where it says, what do you think Agile is? Is it a software development process? Is it an adjective? Is it a mindset? Or is it a set of best practices?
I would say three.
Three, yeah. It's a mindset. Agile, at the end of the day, has two components to it. It's doing Agile and being Agile. And together, those two things will form your Agile mindset. And that's why I said in the beginning of the session, it's one thing to say, I have a Kanban board and now I'm Agile. You're not Agile, you just have a Kanban board. And that's where a lot of organizations misinterpret it. I mean, Louise, you mentioned this in the beginning of the session. The side here where we speak about being Agile, that is really like the foundations of what enables the doing Agile side of things. So all those frameworks, all those practices, all of this, so your transparency, your collaboration, your trust, the 12 principles, your values, that's everything that is going to enable that. And in order to apply transparency, collaboration, trust, that's not software specific. You should have that in any environment, I believe. And I mean, as for Kanban, you don't need to use specifically for software development purposes. You can use it for anything. I mean, we've done, something like, to just explain it a bit better, we had a tender due a couple months back. We used a Scrum board to help us manage getting that tender and all the information for that tender in place on time. You can apply it anywhere. And I know if you research or if you Google Agile in recruitment, there's some really interesting scenarios about how people have taken the Agile fundamentals and applied it to make their other business processes a little bit more streamlined and even speed up their recruitment processes. So yeah, although it was developed by software engineers for the purpose of software development, it was only developed there because they saw a gap in that industry. But you can apply this anywhere. I mean, just the principle of Scrum and all these other elements is really just a way of working and how to do certain things. You can apply that anywhere. We've just seen how it works with software development projects. I mean, it doesn't even have to be just software. Any technology or any project that you're launching, these things can be applied to, and we've seen so many success stories of how they have been applied. Let me just see here if I've missed anything else. So that answers that. So Kat, I don't know if you're on the call. So Kat is our DevOps guru. I don't know if you just want to give us a breakdown of what DevOps actually is quickly.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, DevOps it's also like a culture. It's just a way to bring so like development and operation work together, so that it just streamlines like the process of delivering applications and stuff like that. So when you so it's almost like normal software companies would separate operations, like operation work, from developers. So the developer wouldn't really understand where the software is going to be deployed and the environment and if it deployed successfully and all these things. So DevOps just brings all those things together, just so that it just enables the developers to write better quality software.
Thanks, Kat. And I mean, we use DevOps. So I mean, we use quite a lot of things. I mean, I saw something in the chat just now, so I've just lost it. But organizations customize their approach to what works for them at the end of the day. So what works for one organization might not work for the next, because you're two completely different organizations. One, you might be working with quite fixed constraints. In other words, waterfall might work for you. I mean, waterfall's a project management approach, also got success stories. But for us specifically at Eblocks, I know on one of our current projects, we make use of Scrum, but then we also use engineering practices from extreme programming, like test-driven development and paired programming. And then we have that DevOps element in it, because DevOps and actual development work go hand in hand. And that all forms part under our Agile umbrella at the end of the day. And which is it's the principles, it's our values, and it's everything that drives us to deliver better quality software at the end of the day. And I mean, it's Agile in itself is not something everyone just grasps overnight. It does take time to actually adjust to it, and it's like, I mean, Louise mentioned previously, it's a complete culture change, especially if you haven't worked in these types of environments before. If you're exposed to it early on, it is a lot easier, because it's what you're familiar with, it's what you begin working with, you know, especially if this is like your first organization working with Agile and your first job. It's great because that's what you become exposed to. But I think it's because it's also quite a new concept to a lot of organizations, that some organizations are struggling to actually grasp this concept. But if we look at this presentation, if we look at these things, I mean, ignore the doing Agile side of things for now. Ignore Scrum, ignore Kanban, ignore all those things, and just focus on the being Agile side. If we think about those 12 principles we just discussed, and the idea of just being transparent, collaborative, trusting, being open, being user-centered, being value-centered, those are all things we should actually be doing in our day-to-day lives while we're working. Because one, that's gonna build an awesome team culture and an awesome way of working that you can actually trust your team members. Everything here that's on the left-hand side, that is just how we do it. If you think about it, it's a way of doing something. It's an approach. So if I look at Scrum, for example, Scrum is all about certain ceremonies that we have in place. It's having your stand-ups, and all of those principles and the activities that you do as part of those frameworks, that actually just enables you to deliver when you need to and how you need to. But everything on the right-hand side here, that is your core foundation. Without that, you can never actually achieve everything on the left properly. And I think the stuff on the left is easy because you can there's so many papers. I mean, it's so simple to actually do it. I can set up a couple of meetings for everyone to attend, and I can set up a Scrum board and manage it. But without the stuff on the right, a lot of the stuff on the left isn't going to be achieved to its full potential. Okay. I just want to see if I've missed any other questions in the chat quickly.
Looks nice, dude.
So I see there's a question here. How can this help to prevent or eliminate hiccups, and how to create a trusting partnership? So what do you mean by prevent and eliminate hiccups? Is anyone there? So look, I mean, I don't know if I'm interpreting the question correctly, but you're going to have hiccups on any project. Okay, you cannot control everything, unfortunately. I wish I could. I'm a control freak of note. But at the end of the day, it's how you manage the things that are coming in, and I mean, if something comes up and it's a blocker, something's changed, right? And it's about how you handle it. A lot of the time, and I mean, it goes down to just general project management in general, is making sure you're aware of what risks are on your project. It's identifying your dependencies early on, seeing what issues there are, and it's about addressing them as soon as possible. So you'll see a lot of the time when you start a project, initially what you'll do is you'll draw up what we call a stakeholder map. And that's essentially a view of all your direct stakeholders that are involved on the project, and any external stakeholders that maybe just have a vested interest. But you need to know who those people are, because if something changes and it results in a hiccup or a blocker or a risk, we need to know who to go to address that problem, and how we're going to address it relatively quickly. Because if you leave those things to sit for too long, you're going to end up with a backlog full of blockers, and you're not actually going to be making any progress. So Agile in itself doesn't mean that you're not going to run into challenges. Any project you can run into challenges, or if you're doing work in general, I mean, your internet could go down, that's a challenge, but Agile's not going to fix it. But being Agile is, okay, let me turn my hotspot on quickly and carry on working. That's where the agility comes in, because that's all it actually means. It's responding to change. I mean, nothing stays the same. I mean, if we think about like COVID-19, for example, how many organizations were quickly able to just go, you know what, we're going to go remote now? Some organizations, it happened faster than others because they were already set up and already quite adaptive to change to take that type of thing on. Whereas other organizations had to take a progressive approach to it. And that might have impacted their operations. It could have done a whole lot of things. It's really just being adaptive to change and seeing how that impact comes in. Okay. So we've gone through the Agile mindset, so I'm not going to cover that. But lastly, now we sort of we've got a good understanding of what those 4 principles are, what the 4 values are, and what the 12 principles are. What do you think the intention of Agile is on a project?
It It would be the ability to adapt to the changes in the reality. So like you were saying, when you hit blockers or something changes in the requirements, it's that ability to pivot and respond to change.
Exactly. And by responding to that change, you're able to better meet your customers' needs, right? Okay. So really, it's all about being customer focused, because ultimately when the changes come in, our objective is still to develop and meet the customer's goals and develop value at the end of the day. So we've got to take those changes into consideration and really just keep going. We can't let them stop us. It's about taking it on, seeing how it impacts, and we put it in, we carry on with it. Change is not always necessarily a bad thing. It can make us quite flustered because it's something new and it's something we're not used to. But it's really just about taking on and embracing it anyways. Now, a lot of the Agile methodologies kind of support this concept, and it's becoming a reality because it allows the Agile team to sort of modify the process and make the process fit for them instead of the other way around. Now, like I said, just because a methodology is being defined, it doesn't mean that it's going to suit every team culture in each organization. But with the Agile approach, it gives you the flexibility to make that process right for you, to enable your team. Okay. And Agile essentially views these changes that could potentially come in as an improvement to the project that will provide additional value. And that's important. Any change that comes in, that is how we need to look at it. If it's not doing that, then it's a discussion between the business and the technical team to say, you know what, how does this fit into the overall picture? Because, and then it's a discussion just to see how things happen. If there isn't any business value, but it's something that's critical, then it has motivation of its own. Okay. And I think the important thing that we need to understand here, and we spoke about it briefly, is even though this manifesto was developed and written by a group of software developers and a tester, it was designed to address software development issues. But when you look at that Agile mindset, if you look at that diagram that I showed you, you can easily apply that to other activities. And when you do that, Agile in itself just becomes an adjective at the end of the day. It describes how you are doing something. It's not a whole new methodology on its own. It just describes how we are performing our work. And I think if you start extending this idea that Agile is a mindset, you're going to have people start asking themselves more frequently, how can we better structure and operate our organization in such a way that it allows us to create and respond to change and deal with all this uncertainty in this environment? Because things change all the time and you need to be able to adapt to them in order to succeed. Otherwise, you're going to be set back. And I mean, the COVID scenario is a great example of it. Because that was a massive change. No one saw it coming. But you know what? You pick up your feet, you do what you need to do, and you find new ways of doing things. And I mean, we saw that in the principles as well. I think it was principle number 6, where we speak about face-to-face interactions being better. When you're forced to be in a situation where you cannot be face-to-face with your team, you pick up other pieces and you start making it work. We've taken on new technologies such as Mural, which allows us to do all of our sprint planning, like requirements analysis, and it allows us to all be on a call together. We can see each other, but we can also see what the other person's doing while I'm doing something else. It's great, it's collaborative, and you find new ways of doing things to make it work for you because you have no other choice. So that pretty much sums up our session for today. I think before I close off, do we have any final questions?
Hi Taylor, sorry, one last question.
No problem.
Hi. With regards to the mentorship that you spoke about briefly, I know it's adjacent to Agile, it'd be nice to learn from someone who has experiences. What would your suggestion be to approach someone and ask for a mentorship or advice, or someone who's in the industry, and how to get it from them or work with them?
So look, I mean, if you are following someone who you think is got sort of the same values of you, and there is some sort of alignment between the two of you, and you actually really like what they do, reach out to them via LinkedIn, or if you have their contact details, reach out to them there. People are actually really willing to step in and help. I mean, if I look now, I see we've got Janine on the line. Janine was actually just like a colleague of ours that we happened to work with. And when we approached her to help mentor and help with the EG program, she jumped right on board because it's something she's passionate about. So people are really willing to step in and help people grow and progress in their career. And especially if you are looking for specifically like a female mentor, this community is actually so big. It's just about putting the right people together and building that network. But yeah, reach out to them via LinkedIn. If you have their email address, pop them an email, or if you've got their WhatsApp number, WhatsApp them. People are really open to these types of things. I don't know. Yeah, sorry, Candice.
So Chelsea, just in addition to that, that's part of what this program is about. This program is set up in such a way not only to reskill and upskill women in the industry and enable them to go out there and find gainful employment through the program, but it's also set up in such a way that we brought on women in tech who are on the line. Some of them are on the line. Some of them have said, yes, please, I'm very keen on getting involved in mentoring other women in the industry. So if there are specific areas in which you are looking for specific type of mentorship, reach out to us and let us know. We'll gladly put you in touch with the right individuals.
Thank you. That'd be brilliant.
I see, Dora, you're also struggling with your mic there. But if I look, I mean, industries where Agile can be used, obviously, predominantly we see Agile in the tech space. But we've also had connection, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Candice, we had a company come to us looking to bring Agile into the market risk space. So, I mean, that's risk modeling and finance. Like I've mentioned, obviously, recruitment, HR. So there are a bunch of different areas. I mean, it's not necessarily software development either. I mean, we've worked on data science projects where we do that using the Scrum methodology as well. Obviously, it's all technology related, I guess, but you can apply it in any industry. It's not industry specific. Okay. So there's a question here that says, how does the Agile testing differ from other testing? So Agile doesn't necessarily have its own way of testing per se. We just test more frequently. So I think that, and I mean, my team will probably back me up here. We test often. Because you're delivering so frequently, you've got to make sure that you're doing all that testing while you're building as well, to make sure that whatever you release is of good quality. So the testing procedure doesn't change, it's just we're doing it a lot more frequently. And I know at Eblocks as well, we tend to do checks almost at every step, like whether it's before a developer takes on work, so they understand what work they're taking on, they're actually going to build the right thing, we do that. Before that card even goes into a testing phase, we check it again to make sure that it's correct, because it just speeds things up a little bit. Before we would say, okay, no, it's done, but it's not actually done, you've got to go back and rework it. So I wouldn't say that testing in Agile operates any other way to normal testing, it's just we do it a lot more often. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're obviously going to share these slides with you, and then we're also going to share a quick questionnaire with you guys, just to see, just in terms of what days are better suited for you to attend these types of sessions going forward, and maybe what time as well. That way it allows us to better plan around these things. Also, just to make sure that everyone can actually attend these sessions. And then we'll also put through a very brief Agile assessment, so that if you want to complete that assessment, we can review it, point you in the right direction, and see that you're actually on the right page when it comes to understanding the Agile methodology. So I see, I don't know if it was Jerry or Candice for sharing, they've shared the links in the chat, but we will share these slides with you via email as well, and the links are obviously on the last slide there. Okay. But I think just in closing, I mean, I'm really happy with the turnout that we had, and I really hope the session was informative for you. And I really hope to see you at our next session next week, where Janine is going to be taking us through an introduction to product ownership and systems thinking. It's going to be quite an interesting workshop. And yeah, looking forward to getting to know you all a little bit better, and hopefully one day soon we'll be able to have the session face to face like we originally planned. Cool. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time, and then we will chat again soon. Have a lovely Friday.
Thanks, guys. Bye. Cheers, guys. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Bye.